Software is simply a set of instructions for a computer to follow, and a programming language is a way for you to specify those instructions in a way that the computer can understand. So interestingly, English and other natural languages are quickly becoming programming languages in a sense because you can simply prompt an AI and it will go and do something for you. However, there is an important difference between regular programming languages and natural languages in that programming languages are much more precise. They will follow exactly the instructions that you write out, whereas English is very open to interpretation. So if I tell you that I want a component moved a little bit to the right, that doesn't tell you exactly how far it should be moved. Whereas in a programming language, you would specify the number of pixels or a percent. That way that the computer could actually follow those instructions. Now, because this video is a part of the AI Coding 101 series, we're taking a new approach to learning how to code. We're going to be heavily relying on AI both to learn and to write code for us. But you'll see that understanding the basics and how programs actually work can be really helpful in directing AI and getting what you want more quickly, and then also knowing the limitations of what's actually possible. Now, there's a bunch of different programming languages, but we're just going to focus on JavaScript because it works in the front end, on the back end, and it is just a nice language to get started with, and AI knows it very well because there's so many examples that it has been trained on. The other benefit we get with JavaScript is that it is an interpreted language, which means we can run the code as soon as we write it. There are also compiled languages like C or Rust that take an extra step to translate the code into machine code. They're going to be much better for performance, but for the sake of learning, let's start with a really common interpreted language, JavaScript. So let's go ahead and get started, and we'll have AI write a very simple program and then explain what's going on so that we can take a closer look and start to understand the code. To start, make sure you have some kind of code editor downloaded. This can be either VS Code with GitHub Copilot, or what I'm using here today is Cursor. Essentially, you just want a code editor that's going to have AI built in so that you don't have to keep copy pasting and flipping between ChatGPT. Ultimately, regardless of programming language, code is always just text in a file. And we have special programs that can then execute the instructions of that file. So because we're going to be writing in JavaScript, you're going to want to download Node.js so that you can run JavaScript directly on your computer instead of the browser. And it will also come with NPM, which is the Node Package Manager, which allows you to install dependencies, which we'll cover in a later video in the series. So let's go ahead and create our first JavaScript file, and we'll just call it example.js. And without even knowing any JavaScript, you can go and have the AI start to write code for you, and then we'll have it explain the code so you can start to understand what is going on. Okay, in the prompt, I'm going to say, I'm learning how to code and want you to write a simple program that will help me learn how to read and write JavaScript. This is going to help set the tone for the AI here, so it's going to be very deliberate and very simple instead of trying to write something very complex. And then I'm going to say, please create a simple imperial to metric converter, and we can start with converting miles to kilometers. So I'm starting off with the chat version here where it's going to explain things for me. If I wanted it to write directly to my files, I would use the composer mode of Cursor or the edit mode of GitHub Copilot. Okay, so it's written a simple JS file for us. We can click apply and it will put it directly into the file. Now we can look over this and try to understand what is going on. So, okay, we got a function to convert miles to kilometers. And then it has this conversion rating. Okay, kilometers, well, we multiply the miles by the conversion rating. And then to fixed, well, okay, it says return the result rounded to 2 decimal places. Okay, but how do we run this? Okay, so this is where the terminal comes into play. And this is another important tool for you as you're starting to learn how to code. Once we have this code, we need to be able to actually run it. And we installed Node.js earlier, so we can use Node.js to now run this code. And you'll do this. I went up here to the terminal, new terminal. The terminal is just a way for you to give direct instructions to your computer on what it should do. And in this case, we want to run this JavaScript file. So I'm going to type in Node, which we installed earlier, and then I'm going to type example.js. So now I have these numbers printed out to the terminal. And that's what is going on here when it does this console log. That is going to put things into the terminal. And when the program is running, this is your way to print things. In different languages, it might be, printf in Python, for example. In JavaScript, it's console log. That's how we're going to write to the log. Okay, so we have a super basic program, but as a beginner, you might not understand, like, what is a function, what is a const, what is return. We can start to ask the AI all of these questions, and that's why it's never been easier to learn how to code. So let's go ahead and ask about all of those different terms, and we'll have it define them for us. I'm just going to say, can you explain what the following are? And then I listed them. I found that with prompting, less is more. If you can keep your prompt specific and simple, you're going to get the best results. All right, so it's returned to us some definitions. Okay, what is a function? Function is like a recipe. It's a reusable block of code that performs a specific task. In our code, the function miles to kilometers creates a function that is named miles to kilometers, takes one input parameter called miles, and contains instructions on converting miles to kilometers. Okay. Now, as you're reading through this, you might see other terms that you're not sure about, like what is a parameter and how does that factor in? And you can just start to build this list of things that you want to ask the AI, and then you can always go back and ask these follow-up questions. All right, so a const declares a constant variable, a value that cannot be changed after it is set. Once you assign a value to a const, you can't assign it a different value. A return specifies what value a function should output when it's finished. Console log is what we talked about earlier. So this is a great way to get started with learning some of the syntax of a particular language. And another thing I'll mention is you see these little green areas. These are called comments, and these are part of the code that is not going to run. So they're just really for you as the reader. So we can always ask the AI to add comments to our code that are going to explain what the code is actually doing. I'll ask it one more kind of explanatory follow-up, which is, what is this doing step by step? This is a good way to get into the deeper details as well. So here we can see that let's break down console log miles to kilometers 10 step by step. First, we do miles to kilometers of 10, which passes the number 10 in here and then gets a result, which is in the return. And then we're going to pass that result into the console log. So it's going to print it to our terminal. Now you'll notice one thing I'm doing here is I'm working with actual code and I'm having it answer the questions about my code. This is a much better approach than just trying to learn all of the terminology all at once and hoping that you remember it. It's much better to just be hands-on, and then you'll be able to link all of these answers to specific things that you're working with. So now that AI can write the code, you can just be a lot more involved in the code that it writes and try to understand it and use that as the way to learn instead of just trying from scratch and trying to learn all the vocabulary in one go. Let's go ahead and ask it to add some additional converters for us. Can you please add additional converters for other distances? Okay, and we'll go ahead and apply this code. And now we have a few more functions. And you can see that we're calling these different functions in the console log. So we can say, 1 kilometer is 1 kilometer to miles, that many miles. And then we have a converter for feet and meters. So now we have a few different functions that it has written for us. And as a reminder, a function is just a piece of code that transforms something you put into it into something that comes out of it. So think of it as this kind of box that accepts certain inputs, it does something to them in the middle, and then it outputs something. So that's what all these converters are doing. If we run the program again, we will see, the output of those console logs. Now let's evolve this program further and have it accept some sort of input that we provide to it, and we can also say which conversion we would like to happen so that we can convert a certain number of miles to a certain number of kilometers, or any of these other conversions that we've written. I'm going to say, I want to make it so that I can specify the number I want converted and the units, and then the program will convert it for me. How can we do that? And it's going to go ahead and write some code for us. Okay, so it's written something a little bit more complicated for us. So let's go ahead and accept that code, and then we're going to read through this and try to understand what's going on. So now we have this new function to handle all conversions. It's going to take a value, a from unit, and a to unit, and then it's going to lowercase them and apply this logic. We got all these if-else statements. So how does that work? Let's go ahead and have it explain this for us. Can you explain the if and else statements and how they work? What is the syntax? So the basic syntax is if, we got parentheses, a certain condition, there's going to be a curly brace, and then there's going to be some code that runs if that condition is true. Otherwise, it's going to run this else if block, and we're going to look for another condition, and then there's going to be some other code. So here is the example from our code, right? It's going to first check if the from unit is equal to miles, and then the to unit is kilometers, and then it's going to return the miles to kilometers of the value. So it's going to run that other function that we defined and return the value of that. So you can see these functions kind of start to wrap around each other, and this convert function is using these other functions that we have previously defined. So now you're starting to learn these conditional statements like if else, and we're starting to see functions call other functions as well. So the code is starting to get more complex, and it can be a good opportunity to just take a step back, really read through this and try to understand it, because this is going to help you go much faster when you're working with AI, when you can look at the code and understand what's going on, and then tell AI, we need to change this particular statement because this conversion is, not working correctly. That's going to be a lot better than telling the AI, things aren't working, I'm getting bugs, this is bad. Because that way you're going to just end up spinning your wheels and the AI is not going to be sure what it should fix. So really just take some time and try to learn some of this stuff. And remember, you can always ask AI to explain it. So you don't need to remember the syntax for everything, but it really does help to have a grasp over programming basics like what functions are and conditional statements and loops, because that will help you direct AI to do more of what you want. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is data. And data can be any piece of information that you're passing into a function or that you're storing in some way. And in our example right now, we have 3 parameters that we're passing into this convert function. We have the number, the from unit, and the to unit. But we could actually group them into one object, which represents a conversion task. So an object is really just a group of various elements. So if I was trying to describe a house, for example, my object might include things like the square footage, number of windows, the address that it's located at, and all of these different properties would describe the object that is, a data representation of the home. Objects represent a specific piece of data, and they can be all different kind of shapes and sizes, but ultimately they're just a set of these different properties. So to show you what objects look like in JavaScript, I'm going to go ahead and submit this prompt. Let's explore the idea of objects and convert the current inputs into an object that contains the 3 necessary properties. We'll go ahead and apply this code, and you can see the specific changes that it's making. We'll accept the file. I'm not sure what this conversion data is doing, so let's go ahead and just ask that. Okay, so the conversion data object is redundant. Let's go ahead and just remove that. Okay, great. So now we have this convert function, and it only accepts one input, which is data. And then we're pulling these different properties out of data, and then we're pretty much doing the same thing. But now, instead of having 3 inputs that we're passing into convert, we have this object. And this object has 3 properties: the value, the from unit, and the to unit. Again, feel free to take some time and just ask AI about how these different objects work and what are different properties and how you can structure them. Understanding objects is going to be very important in telling your program how it should function. Now, if we just run this, we will see it's running on this data. And if I change 10 miles to 20 miles, and then I run the program again, we see a new number gets output. Now, since we're exploring the concept of data, we should also talk about specific data types. And I'm going to ask the AI to create a file for me that just demonstrates all of this very effectively. So I'll go ahead over to the composer so that it just writes the file immediately for me. And you can do this with edit in the GitHub Copilot. So I'll go ahead and say, I am learning to code and learning about basic data structures. Please create a simple file for me that demonstrates different objects and data types in JavaScript. It looks like it actually went ahead and overwrote my file, and I like the example, but I do want it in a different file. So I'm just going to go ahead and ask, please create this in a separate file. Okay, so we got, now this is in this data types file, and we're going to go ahead and reject the changes to our example so we can keep our converter. And in this data types file, we can go ahead and accept those changes. So now we have some examples. So taking a look here, we got some different data types, and then they kind of build up from there. I will say that different languages handle this differently. So in JavaScript, yeah, all numbers are just handled in the same way, but in other languages, you might have different types for things like integers versus numbers with decimals in them. So this is a good exercise to do whenever you're trying out a new language and trying to understand it. Just have the AI generate a file for you that shows you some concrete examples. So numbers are fairly self-explanatory. Strings are just anytime you have text. So if we have, hello world here, we can in JavaScript specify with single quotes or double quotes. It doesn't really matter. We can also pass in some data into the string so that it creates a string that is based on some data. Then we have Booleans, which just means if something is true or false. We got undefined and null values. There are arrays, which are a set of values. So arrays are going to be super useful if you want to have a collection of something. So for this example, we have somebody with a list of hobbies that they're interested in, reading and coding. And then of course we have these objects, which we were talking about earlier, which contain a set of the different properties. Then of course we have functions, we have dates, and then over here it's essentially just printing all of this information out to the console like we were looking at earlier. Let's go ahead and run this file. Now we're going to say node data types.js, and it's going to run all of these different steps. I should mention that code generally runs top to bottom, but it's a little bit tricky because if I do something like define a function, all I'm doing is defining that function at that time. I'm not actually running the function. So although I define the function greet here, I'm not actually using it in any way until I get to this point over here. Different languages are going to have some different rules and how the code is organized and the syntax that it follows. And again, AI is your best friend in those situations. Just have it explain it to you. But most of the time, you should be able to look at a piece of code and then kind of read through it sequentially to try to understand what is happening. And just ask AI to add comments to that code if you're not really quite sure. One last fundamental concept I want to cover here is the notion of loops. So let's go ahead and ask the composer to create a new file for us that demonstrates this. Okay, so it created a file for us with a bunch of different loops. Loops are ultimately just a way to do something multiple times, and you could do that on a set number of times. You could loop over an array that contains a certain number of values, and then you do the same thing to each one of those values. Or you could keep looping until a certain condition is met, like with a while loop. So I know there's a lot of code, and if you've never done this before, it might be overwhelming, but we can just zoom in to, an individual part of it and try to understand it. So our first example, we have a for loop, and there's a bunch of syntax here, and it might be hard to understand or remember how it works. So we'll just highlight that, and then we'll ask it to explain it in detail. It helps to add that you're learning to code. And here again, it will explain it for us. The for loop has 3 parts inside the parentheses separated by semicolons. First, we initialize I to 0. It creates a variable. It starts at 0. And that happens when the loop starts. Then there's a condition where it's going to keep looping until that condition is met. And in our case, that condition is I is less than the numbers.length. So it's going to keep checking if I is less than that on every single loop. And then when it is not, it's going to stop the loop. And then at the end of each of those loops, it's going to add 1 to I. So here again, it explains I++, right, is the same thing as writing I equals I plus 1. So whatever the number is, just add 1, set it, and then on the next iteration of the loop, it's going to be 1 higher. So here it's going to explain for us how this happens in practice. So if we start with this array of 5 numbers, it's going to output, index 0 is 1. And by the way, this is another programming thing. All of these arrays, they have an index which represents the position of each item in that array. And those arrays start with the position 0, not 1, 0. So in our array here, we have the number 1 is in position 0. Number 2 is in position 1. And so that's why we have this kind of offset, index, and then the actual number that we see in this array. Then we have a more readable loop, and this is going to essentially loop over all of the values in this numbers array, right? And then just print out the number. So this is a little bit more readable, but functionally it does the same thing. And you'll see, you can go through the rest of the list here, and I'm going to have all this code available for GitHub so that you can explore it. But you can start to learn these different pieces of syntax and understanding how the requests that you make to AI ultimately map into these different programming language structures, which are then going to be the actual program that you write. All of these examples have been in JavaScript, which is a great programming language to start with, but keep in mind that if you're working with a different language, you're going to have different rules for the syntax. Like if you're working in Python, having this indented is going to cause the program to behave differently. So you're just going to want to rely on AI and ask questions about the specific syntax. But also don't get too caught up on learning all of the syntax, because your goal is ultimately to understand enough of the code so that you can write better prompts and break out of those AI troubleshooting loops. We covered a ton of programming basics, which is definitely going to help you understand how your software works and then create better prompts. But there's more to prompting than simply understanding the code. Knowing how to word your prompts and what to tell the AI when you're troubleshooting or when you're trying to learn a particular concept is also super important. So make sure to check out the next video, which is the ultimate prompting guide. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you there. Take care.